I want to talk about a heart for the nations this morning. So if you want to turn to Acts chapter 17, that's where we're going to be. And I want to kind of give us a perspective of where our heart should be as believers, where we should be as the 456, and having a desire for the nations to hear the gospel and to know Jesus Christ. While you're turning there, let me just give you some thoughts. Acts chapter 17 is where we're going to be, starting in verse 16. I don't know if you guys know this about me, but I have been traveling, doing ministry on the road since 2005 as kind of like a job. When we first planted this church, well, and for the majority of time until like recently, like this was not our income. And so Ryan and Pierce and I have always done other things. And so my other income was traveling and preaching and leading worship. And I still do that on the road a lot. And through the years, I have become, just being transparent, I've become a little bit picky about the hotels I stay in. And without making a long story long, I have a few rules about hotels. One, if the front door doesn't open for me, it's a no-go. Like if it's not an automatic front door, it's a no-go. If I have to open the door, if the room's on the outside, it's only in dire straits. It's only because I need somewhere to sleep right now, not because I want to stay there. And then let me just be honest. I have had some bad experiences at hotels, and you can call it stereotyping. You can give me a hard time all you want, but almost every time I've had a hard time at a hotel, it has been from a certain people group that run and own the hotel. Nobody else asks me for my license to make a copy of my driver's license unless they're from a giant country in the East, like the biggest country in the world. And I got to be honest, when I walk into a hotel, if it smells like curry, I get this like weird feeling inside of me like I don't want to be here. I was at a hotel in Austin, same situation recently. The dude took my credit card for a deposit, and then he took my license and wanted to make a copy of my license and my credit card together. And I was like, bro, what are you doing? I was like, you cannot have. He was like, I got to have it. I'm like, no, you do not. I was like, you're brown, I'm brown. Don't treat me like this. If I walk in and it's that people group, like, call it whatever you want. That's my experience, right? I have this weird feeling like I just get a little bit frustrated. I haven't even gotten to the hotel yet. I'm frustrated. And it hit me one day. I'm griping and complaining about the hotel I'm staying in because this church put me up in a hotel that smelled like curry and my clothes smelled like curry and just wasn't a good experience. And I began to ask this question as I was griping and complaining in my hotel room. How would my perspective of people change if my desire was for the world to know Jesus without any concern for me? How will my perspective of these people at the hotel change if my perspective was I want them to know Jesus without any concern for my preferences or my comforts? What would it look like if I actually had a heart for the nations to know Jesus without any concern for my comfort? And that's what I want us to look at today. What does it look like to have a heart for the nations? Acts chapter 17, Paul is, in verse 15, he tells you he's in Athens. He got brought to Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, these people departed. So Paul is in this town called Athens, still the same town as it is today, and he's waiting for Silas and Timothy to come. And here's where we're going to focus in. Verse 16, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogues with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace, and every day with those who happened to be there. Verse 16 again. While Paul was waiting for them, while he was waiting for Silas and Timothy in Athens, here's what happened. His spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. Here's the first thought I want to give you from Paul in Acts chapter 17. A heart for the nations. I think Paul tells us here, a heart for the nations is a heart broken for the lost world. A heart for the nations is a heart that is broken for the lost world. Look at what he does. Verse 16. He's waiting for them in Athens, and his spirit was provoked. Say provoked. His spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. You don't hear Paul whining and complaining about the smell of these people's food and how it's getting on his clothes. What does he do? He looks around and he sees all these idols, and it says that his heart was provoked within him. Because he saw the wickedness and the city that's full of idols are worshiping these other gods. The word provoked here in the Greek, it's not like bothered. It implies a severe emotional concern. He's not like just bothered that they have idols here. He is like severely concerned emotionally for the state of this city, for the state of these people, that they have no relationship with God. This isn't like I just don't like it here. This is like I have a deep concern and brokenness for these people because they do not know Jesus. When my youngest son Hayes was born, I think I've mentioned this before, they told us he had a bad heart. His heart's fine. He was totally fine. But when they told us that, I'm a fixer. I want to fix everything. I was at my in-laws' house yesterday, and my wife asked me to look at their dishwasher disposal, and that turned into me pulling the disposal out, breaking the valve. There's water spraying everywhere in the kitchen. I can't find the tool to turn the water off. Finally get the water. Like it was like 2.5 hours of me she just asked me to check the disposal. Like I want to fix everything. I can't fix my son's heart. They tell me my son has a bad heart. I am literally on my face on the floor in the hospital, weeping and crying and asking God, heal my son's heart. Say provoked. That's the word. And if I'm being honest, I'm not sure there's a lot of times in my life that I have that same kind of emotional concern for the lostness of the world. A heart for the nations is a heart that is broken, that is provoked for the world to hear the gospel. Verse 22. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For I passed along and observed the objects of your worship. I found also an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. What therefore you worship is unknown, this I proclaim to you. Let me set this up for you. So Paul's waiting in Athens for Timothy and Silas. He looks around and sees all these idols, and he's provoked because he realizes these people need Jesus. And so he goes into the synagogues and starts teaching like he normally does amongst the Jews. The synagogues is where the Jews were, even in these Gentile areas. They had their own synagogue. He'd go in and meet with them, and he starts talking about Jesus. You can read in the verses before, prior to verse 22. And the people of Athens hear about it, and so they want to know what he's talking about. So they bring him to this place called the Areopagus, or the Hill of Ares, where they did like councils, and they did judgments, and they did meetings, and people would get together and talk about philosophy. It was called Mars Hill. And so they bring Paul to this place, the Areopagus, at this place called Mars Hill. And they're like, hey, we want to know. We want to know about this teaching. And so look what Paul does. Look what Paul does. Verse 22. So he stands in the Areopagus, and here's what he says. He doesn't say, let me just be clear. He doesn't say, you're idiots. Here's what he says. Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious, for I passed along and observed the objects of your worship. I found also an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. Therefore, what you worship is unknown. This I proclaim to you. And then he's about to tell them about Jesus. So here's what he does. Ready? Let me just give you the thought. A heart for the nations, like Paul, is willing to contextualize. Say contextualize. Contextualize to other cultures for the sake of the gospel. A heart for the nations is willing to contextualize to other cultures for the sake of the gospel. He doesn't get to their council, to the Areopagus, to Mars Hill, where they're talking about philosophy and talking about new ideas and say, you're all idiots. He gets there and he goes, hey, I perceive that you've got all these gods that you worship. In fact, I even noticed that you have an idol that says, To the unknown God. And here's what he says. Ready? I know who that is. He takes their culture, he contextualizes into their culture and uses it as a means for the gospel. If we're going to have a heart for the nations, we've got to be willing to contextualize to other cultures for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of Jesus, to be aware of where we're at and the culture we're in. I was at a conference a few years ago with my dad at a seminary in Texas, at Southwestern Seminary, and man, I'm a church planner. I grew up, my dad's a pastor. I grew up in his church. It's very baby boomer. It's very slacks, pleated slacks with button-ups and penny loafers, and hair's got to be good. It's like, you know what I'm talking about, those of you who've been in church a long time. Like, it's very much that. That was never me. I was that pastor's kid, right? So I go to this conference. I'm already an adult at this point. It's just a few years ago, and I go with my dad and his penny loafers to this conference with a whole bunch of pastors, and everybody kept staring at me. And first I'm like I'm always like, am I like the only brown guy here? Like, what? And then I was like, no, there's a bunch of Hispanics here, and I'm not Hispanic, but like there's a bunch of people that look like me here. And I couldn't figure it out. At the end of the day, it hit me. I was the only person wearing a hat. And I didn't know that seminary had a rule that you can't wear a hat on campus. I had no idea, right? Just because they have a stupid rule doesn't mean I'm going to know about it, right? But I didn't recognize where I was. I wasn't say contextualize. I didn't contextualize into the culture that I was in. Even if I think the culture is stupid. What a dumb rule, right? But if my heart is for the sake of the gospel, I want to be where the people are. That's what Paul's doing here. He doesn't come in and say, this is a stupid rule. You guys are idiots because you're worshiping all these other gods. What does he do? Hey, I perceive that you worship all these other gods. You're very religious. In fact, I noticed you have an idol marked to the unknown God. I know who that is. And he uses their culture as a means to proclaim Jesus. So what does that look like for us? How can we do the same thing? How do we contextualize into cultures around us? Let me give you a couple thoughts. One from Paul. First, we can't let our cultural biases stand in the way of the gospel. We cannot let our cultural biases stand in the way of the gospel. As a Jew, it wasn't okay for Paul to be here. Paul was not, by the Jewish culture, allowed to be in the Areopagus with these other people. He wasn't supposed to associate with these non-Jews. But he didn't let his cultural biases hinder the opportunity for him to proclaim Jesus. We can't let our cultural biases stand in the way of the gospel. When I first started playing disc golf 20-something years ago, there was a group of guys that played out here in San Angelo. Obviously, it was obvious none of them knew Jesus, didn't care about Jesus. And so I started playing disc golf with them on a weekly basis. And there were a few people in my life close to me that were believers that said, you've got to stop hanging out with those guys. I was like, why? They said, because they smoke and they drink and they smoke. And they were like, you don't want to be associated with them. And I asked this one person, buddy of mine, this question. I was like, if you're not going to tell them about Jesus, who is? I'm not saying we always I'm not saying go be part of the chaos of the world and just integrate yourself. But listen, I'm allergic to that stuff anyways. There's I'm not going to be, maybe if it was Colorado, it would be a different situation, but I'm not going to be the pastor who's that kind of smoking here. I'm not worried about that. What I'm worried about is that they know Jesus. If we're so worried about our cultural moral biases that we're not willing to engage with people for the sake of the gospel, how in the world will people hear about Jesus? If our expectation is that people can only hear about Jesus when they come into the building, people will never hear about Jesus. What about all the people you work with? What about all the people you play sports with? What about all the people in your life you come in contact with? We gotta let our cultural biases go to the wayside for the sake of the gospel. Listen, I hate Walmart at Christmas. I become this weird animal, like this raged animal, and I've got to put my biases of how things should be in Walmart to the side because I don't want that to be something that hinders the gospel. I could go on and on. We cannot let our cultural biases hinder the gospel. I know missionaries in Southeast Asia, personally. I won't tell you what country, I can't because we're recording this, who have given up their lives in the northern part of their country, in their cities and their good jobs, and they've moved to the south of their country, and they're living amongst the Muslims. They dress like them. They eat like them. They talk like them, except that they tell the Muslims that they are followers of Isa al-Masih, Jesus the Messiah. They don't proclaim they follow their God. They proclaim Jesus, but they live like him. They dress like him. They eat like him. They look like him. Why? Because their cultural biases, they move them to the wayside. In the north where they come from, the Muslims in the south are looked down upon as dirty, no good people. And they put those biases to the side because they want these people to hear the gospel. Ready for a heart check? How do you feel about Muslims? How do you feel about Muslims? If I say Muslim is the first thing you see, someone flying a plane into a building? Is the first thing you see some guy with a rag on his head holding an AK? Or do you see millions and millions and millions of people across the world who need Jesus? If I could tell you, I don't have time, the stories of what God's doing amongst the Muslims. They're having this dream across the world this variance of this same dream where they know it's Jesus. That's what God's doing. And what do? I've been on trips where someone told me to Southeast Asia where someone said, you shouldn't go because it's dangerous. I don't care. I don't care. I care more about them knowing Jesus than I do about this fickle life. So what do? They kill me and I go see Jesus? Awesome. I got life insurance. My family's good. They got a good family of people here that what I want is people to know Jesus. Are we so concerned about things in this life and our comfort in this culture that we're willing to say, I don't care about people knowing Jesus? Stop it. We cannot let our cultural biases get in the way of the gospel. Second thought, we integrate ourselves into the culture we're in. We integrate ourselves into the culture we're in. Notice how Paul starts this conversation in verse 22. He says, I perceive that you're very religious. You have all these gods. He noticed the culture. He didn't expect that the culture morphed to him. He was part of them and he noticed the culture. I think it's really easy for us to get so caught up in telling people around the world how they should live that we miss the opportunity to perceive their culture and use it as a platform for the gospel. We're so concerned about our morals and telling people how they should live that we miss the opportunity to just tell them about Jesus. I don't like the woke agenda. I think it's stupid. I got a lot of other adjectives I'd like to say, but this is not the platform for that. But if I'm so bothered by that culture that I'm not willing to tell them about Jesus, something's wrong in my heart. Something's wrong in my heart. Why are your morals more important to you than the gospel? Ever thought about that? Why are your morals more important to you than the gospel? I grew up in a culture where there was a very strict, here's what you do and here's what you don't do. And some of those things I have blown out of the water. It was not okay to listen to non-Christian music when I was growing up. I destroyed so many good CDs because some pastor at a camp said you got to get rid of those things. I worked so hard to get those. I did the whole 7-for-1 thing. Buy one CD, get 7 free, over and over and over again. I had hundreds of these great CDs. Like I will never get Oasis back. Okay, it gets on Spotify now, but it's different. I worked for that CD. It's gone, right? It was not okay to listen to non-Christian music. You know what I don't do? I don't tell my kids what music they can and can't listen to. I don't even look. Maybe that's bad parenting. But my heart is that their mindset would be, I want to glorify Jesus in everything I do. I don't want them to have that moral boundary as a barrier for the gospel. I want them to be, Grayson is learning, my sixth grader is learning guitar. I don't tell him bro, you shouldn't learn AC/DC songs. Don't you know if you play their records backwards, it's satanic? Learn the song, honor Jesus, let your heart be Jesus. Okay, maybe there's situational things, sure, but I'm not going to make a moral. Why are we more concerned about our morals than we are the gospel? What if my kids what if they didn't listen to non-Christian music? What if Grayson only played worship music on the guitar? What if there was never a bad word that came out of their mouth? What if they never treated anyone badly? What if they did all those things? Would we say they're good kids? Because Mormons and Muslims look just like that, and they're not going to heaven because they don't know Jesus. I'm not interested in my kids being good. I'm interested in my kids being people that glorify Jesus with their entire life because the morals are not the goal. Jesus is. Paul goes, I perceive. And Paul is the self-proclaimed best of the best amongst the Jews. Philippians 3, he's like, I'm the right tribe. I'm the right people group. I'm the best of all the Pharisees. He's like the best Jew who has the best morals, and he's the best of the best amongst the religious moral culture of Israel. What does he do here? He goes and associates with these dirty, scummy, no-good Gentiles. And instead of telling them how awful they are, what does he do? He contextualizes into their culture and perceives what they do, perceives the things around him, so he has an opportunity to share Jesus with them. Last thought, a heart for the nations is always focused on the gospel and only the gospel. Look at verse 24. So here's where Paul says, I know who this unknown God is that you say you worship. Verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of all the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, and they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. And even as some of your own poets have said, and I love this, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. This is Paul preaching. He goes to the Areopagus, and instead of just telling them, you're idiots, you serve the wrong God, he contextualizes himself into that culture, and he uses it as an opportunity to preach. And what does he do? He doesn't divert from the goal of the gospel. He just proclaims the gospel. That whole section, he's just saying, this is Jesus. God has appointed a man to be the Savior, and then he's about to tell him, it's Jesus. It's Jesus. Paul didn't go to the Areopagus, where they would often argue philosophy. He didn't try to argue philosophy with them. He just used their culture and their language to proclaim Jesus. The world just needs the gospel. Let me say it again, because it's as simple as that. The world needs the gospel. They don't need our morals. Side note, how in the world do we expect people to act godly without Jesus? They don't need our morals. What they need is the gospel. They need the gospel. Let me just give you a reminder. Acts 1:8 says, the power of the gospel rests in the Holy Spirit, and not even in us. Because I know some of you are thinking like, man, I can never have a gospel conversation with somebody like Paul did. Listen, Paul's not proclaiming the gospel of his own power. It's by the power of the Spirit that now rests in him. Acts 1:8, I'm sending you my Spirit, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. That's not Paul's power. That's not our power. That's the Spirit that rests in us. It's not our power. I think sometimes we think, when we talk about missions, that we have a corner on the market when it comes to the gospel because we're Americans. We got the structure. We got the money. We got the edge on the market. We have the resources. And so we go to these countries where we want to do missions, and we send this group to Southeast Asia. And you know what? Some of you are going to think like, well, I want to know how many people got saved. What if nobody gets saved on this trip? But what if you find out in 30 years, because of what they did, an imam gets saved? And because the imam gets saved, now everybody in the village gets to hear about Jesus. Are we so concerned about the little, let me tell you how good our mission trip was? Or is the goal just the gospel? Our metrics of these stupid church growth metrics, they cannot be the basis for our success. It has to be the gospel. What if we spend every dime we have on missions as a church and see zero results? Do we say then we've been unsuccessful? No, because if our goal is the gospel, it's been worth every penny. Paul doesn't divert. He doesn't argue with them. He doesn't try to change their mind about their philosophy or their culture. What does he do? He contextualizes into their culture and just tells them about Jesus. This group I have been part of in Southeast Asia, one of the guys that's a missionary is from Southeast Asia. He was a Muslim rebel. He was in this militant army. Sharia law, crazy. Voice of the Martyrs has this part of the country marked as one of the most dangerous places in the world for Christians. And this guy, who's a believer now, was patrolling the streets one day in his town with his AK, with the rag on his head. He's walking down the street, not joking, walks by and finds the Gospel of John in his language laying in the gutter. And he picks it up, and he reads it, and he puts his faith in Jesus. He puts his gun down, leaves the military, And now this dude is proclaiming Jesus to his people on a consistent basis. That's what God's doing. That's what God's doing. I don't know about you, but I want to be part of it. I love this place. The US of A is the greatest place in the history of the world. I love my air conditioner. I love my cars. I like being able to sit on the couch on Sunday afternoons and watch disc golf or whatever else. I like it here. I like it a lot. But if my goal is my comfort, I think there's a chance I'll miss an opportunity to be part of what God's doing in the world for the sake of the gospel. I'm not saying give it up. What I'm saying is let my heart be that I want people to know Jesus no matter the cost. For some of you, for some of us, a heart for the nation simply means that you're consistently and passionately praying for the salvation of the people around the world. For some of you, that's the extent of it. That you have a heart that says, I'm going to pray for the people of the world to know Jesus. For some of us, a heart for the nations means we're using our financial resources to help take the gospel to the world. Listen, this team we're sending to Southeast Asia, they need finances. We're going to have to join together and help them go. For some of us, a heart for the nations literally means we pack up our things and go. And maybe if you're like Colin, it's like pack your backpack because that's what you have. That's what you need to go. It's for some of you, it means you pack your stuff and you go. Whatever the case, listen, a heart for the nations is not something that's for the few. A heart for the nations is for all of us. Whether you're praying, whether you're giving, whether you're going, whatever it is, a heart for the nations is something that we need to have as believers. And I got to tell you, as a 456, this has to be the heart of our church. That we want the nation, starting in San Angelo, to know Jesus. And that's our goal. No matter which one of these scenarios you're in, whether you're a prayer, whether you're a giver, whether you're a goer, no matter which scenario you're in, let's join together, have a heart for the nations, and let's take the gospel to the world. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for today. Thank you that we get to meet here and gather. Thank you for the air conditioning. Thank you for the roof. Thank you for the comfy-ish seats. But God, I pray that all those things would never be the reason that we gather. I pray that we would gather because we have a heart to join together as one body so that the world can see Jesus reflected in us. I pray that we would be the kind of people, God, who would have a heart for the nations in a way that, God, is reflected in everything that we do. In everything that we do. Just where you're at this morning, still with your eyes closed, if you'll just take a moment and if you'll just ask God that, say, God, give me a heart for the nations. And if you'll just ask him, say, God, show me what that looks like for me to be part of the gospel work that you're doing around the world. And last thing, if you'll ask him, say, God, remind me that this is the heart you want me to have.